Hello everyone and welcome. Welcome to our first Advantage Masterclass, a new leadership program and a new format. Wonderful to see you all. You're all sort of pouring in to our virtual doors. So I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes to get everybody in and situated. But thank you all for being here with us today. It's great to see so many participants in name, even if we can't see you. So welcome all. This is the first masterclass of the Advantage Leadership Programme, and I'm delighted that today we're going to feature UK Government Disability Champion for Arts and Culture, Andrew Miller. Welcome, Andrew. You'll see him on the screen in just a moment. My name, for those who don't know me, is Helga Henry, and actually, even if you do, it's still my name. And with my colleague, Lara Ratnaraja, we've created, it says on my notes here, another leadership programme, by which I mean we've done a number of leadership programmes that look at different aspects of diversity. We're seeking to transform the diversity of cultural leadership here in the region. And this time we've got a focus on placing the vantage point of deaf, neurodivergent and disabled creative practitioners at the very heart of leadership. And that's why the programme is called Advantage, amongst many other punny reasons. This work of Advantage builds on our previous work on programmes such as Represent and ASTONish, and it's really lovely to see in the list of participants so many of the fellows of our current cohort and our previous cohorts here tonight. And I think it's because a much loved feature of those programmes was the masterclass, a chance to hear from real experts who are going to share in a very candid way their stories, the lessons and insights that they've gathered along the way. So along with our programme content, which has moved online, we're now moving our masterclass online too. So a big thanks behind the scenes to Gareth, our producer, who's going to help make that happen seamlessly. So in a moment, and here's Andrew. Hi, Andrew. I'll pass over to Andrew and he's going to speak for around 30 minutes. And if you've got questions, please do pop them in the chat. My lovely colleague Lara will be collecting them in for me to ask Andrew in the second half of the session. So if you can remember them, great, but otherwise just pop your questions in the chat and we'll get to them in the second half. I'd also like to welcome someone you can't see, but who's going to play a vital role in tonight's event. I want to welcome Wendy. I'm waving, she can't see. She'll be providing closed captions for this evening. So again, if you sort of look down at the bottom of your screen, if you click on there or hover your mouse, you should be able to see a CC button, and that will let you access the live captioning. Also, if you're new to Zoom, and some people might be still, if you click towards the top of the screen, you'll see that you get an option to view different ways. And if you view side by side, that will let you see both Andrew and the clips and slides that he's going to be showing. So last thing for me to say about this bit is a big thanks to our funder. Coventry City Council has a strategic role in promoting the role of disabled people as both practitioners, leaders and consumer of arts and culture in Coventry. And so this whole programme has been made possible by them. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce Andrew. Welcome. You'll hear all about his career and you've read his bio, so I don't really want to rehash that too much, but starting his life and a career on front of the camera as a children's television presenter, to a life behind the camera, and then to a wider arena of being a real force in the cultural life of this country. Spoiler alert, at one point he was told at school he lacked propriety. Whether that's true or not, I'll leave you to decide. But also, if anybody like me, if you're a fan of 80s haircuts, old school TV graphics, and or music, let me tell you, you're in for a big treat. I know you're all on Zoom, but I can feel the love emanating from your screens. Can we give a big Zoom welcome to Andrew? And Andrew, over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Helga, and good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this masterclass. I've never done one before, so this is a bit of a first for me, and I'm excited to be asked. I guess, like all of us, I spend very little time reflecting on the past and prefer to think about what's coming up next. But 7 months locked down at home has inevitably led me to conjure up happier times. And looking back, I realized that I've led a particularly weird career. So I hope you'll be entertained by my exploits, and I'm looking forward to hearing your own questions and perceptions of it at the end. This journey is going to take us from Scottish golf courses in the 1970s to London television studios in the 90s, shiny Welsh concert halls in the 10s to disability activism today, alongside a motley crew of accomplices from Basil Brush to Nick Sirota and practically everybody in between. Lara has instructed me to name drop, so I hope I don't disappoint. My own story illustrates how a disabled individual can lead a very full life in the UK's creative industries, but it comes at a cost. Whilst my career has been mainly spent in what we might term mainstream settings rather than disability settings, all my choices have been shaped by my disability. It's the single thread that binds everything together that I've done. Throughout my career, I've generated lots of firsts. The first disabled this, the first wheelchair user that. This is quite a common experience for disabled people across the board, but it's not something that I take any great pride or comfort in because each first demonstrates just how far we as a society have yet to go in integrating the disabled experience into the mainstream. We are still perceived as somehow other, and that is what I've spent 30 plus years seeking to address, to democratize our national culture to a point where my participation is not something that is in any way unusual. But I guess that's still some way off from being achieved. Whilst I've been very fortunate in experiencing some amazing helium highs, make no mistake, I've also endured my share of discrimination and setbacks. But those failures have all contributed to who I have become and what I represent. To start at the beginning then, without question, my luckiest break was to be born to my parents, Anne and Norman. To their dying days, they possessed a boundless sense of optimism, which was unique to that interwar generation who rebuilt Britain after 1945. And that spirit of optimism was conveyed consistently to me as a child of the space age, which I interpreted as meaning anything is possible. Now, this is a bit of a treat. This is the only known picture of me in a kilt. The youngest of five, I was always treated as an equal, and my family went to huge lengths to ensure that my options were not in any way limited by my disability. But what came with that was challenging. My father endlessly told me, to get on in life, you are going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else. It was a tough message for any child to receive. It's not that uncommon. And especially, it was tough for me as I knew that I wasn't that academically or physically gifted. So I had to identify and develop my own strengths. My parents recognized this and encouraged me to follow my own interests and opened as many doors for me as they could. They took me and my sister Diane to early Scottish opera and Scottish ballet shows in Glasgow when those companies were first established in the 1970s. These early experiences, I guess, triggered my life passion for the arts. But my parents also didn't go out of their way to make things that easy for me either. They sent me to a Jewish primary school with loads of stairs, which as a non-Jewish wheelchair user was quite a challenge, but also a great deal of fun as I learned very early about the value of multiculturalism to the extent that we became honorary members of the Glasgow Jewish community, and my mother adopted the persona of a Jewish mum and started knocking out lots of gefilte fish. My parents were also very aware that there were no disabled role models in the 1970s to point me to. Indeed, the only time my father ever took me out of school was to meet the World War II flying ace Wing Commander Douglas Bader, who lost his legs in action and was a famous prisoner of war of Colditz. So Douglas didn't let this hold him back in any way, and he became a keen golfer. And one day, quite randomly, he showed up to play a round of golf at my dad's course in Glasgow. So we followed this elderly chap hopping around the golf course. Eventually, I was presented to the great man to hear his words of wisdom that might just alter the course of my life. And they were, keep a stiff upper lip, old boy, don't let the buggers get you down, chocks away. And off he hopped. Not exactly a relatable role model in any sense, but certainly an experience that conveyed something that stayed with me, his determination. A more meaningful golfing expedition was to the final day of the 1977 Open Golf Championship, the famous Jewel in the Sun at Turnberry, near to where we lived in Ayrshire. Not being in any way sporty, I hated golf and being dragged around this course by my golf mad dad. And it was just agony on a blisteringly hot day. And I couldn't see over the heads of the large crowds, and they would not part to let me through to see any of the extravagantly checked trousered golfers. As we headed out to the lighthouse, though, I had a revelation. The crane with the TV cameras suddenly rose ahead of me, and I realized that if you worked in telly, you got a much better view than everyone else. So I resolved that day at the age of 10 that television would be my future. I got my own back on the large crowds too, as Dad somehow managed to get us onto the 18th green, and I got to meet the final playoff pair, Jack Nicklaus and Tom Watson. Although Nicklaus almost decked my father for daring to ask for an autograph as he came off the course, having just lost this epic golf tournament by a single stroke. Secondary school was challenging, as it coincided with my dad's business going into meltdown and us having to sell our home. Wasn't a particularly happy time. I started the school's first fanzine, for which I was nearly expelled by having a lack of propriety, as Helga said, in running an interview with the famous drag act, Hinge and Bracket. But my main memory is that for the whole 6 years of my time at Glasgow High, there was not a single disabled toilet. Don't ask me how I managed or why they didn't install one, although the whole concept of access was in its infancy. Going to the loo is fairly elementary, but that certainly didn't endear me to the school, and perhaps instilled a certain detachment, a bit of an outsiderism in me as well. Things started to look up as I headed off to university to read history. My choice of uni was easy. It had to be accessible, which reduced the options to just one: Stirling, in the Lower Highlands of Scotland. It had been built in the late 60s when architecture started to encompass the needs of disabled people, and it was set in a very beautiful campus. In those days, Stirling was known for being a bit of a hotbed of student rebellion, of communism, and insulting the Queen when she opened it. Indeed, the single disabled loo on campus had in fact been installed for her visit, so I directly benefited from that years later. But I was horribly ungrateful to Her Majesty, as through complete luck in my second year at Stirling, I was invited by the BBC to make an open space documentary about the media relationship with the royal family. Open Space was the first open access programme on British television, and for me it was the most amazing on-the-job training to get to present and produce a half-hour documentary made on real film with extra grain and hiss. I got to spend most of the summer of 1986 in London and hung out with lots of anti-establishment figures like the historian Piers Brendan and the anti-royal MP Willie Hamilton. It went out on BBC Two and was one of the first programmes ever to be even mildly critical of the royal family. As you can imagine, it created a bit of a stir. I received death threats and questions were raised in the House of Commons, which as a student I thought was hilarious. In comparison with today, though, the programme was very, very tame. But I'm delighted to present, for only its second airing to an audience in 35 years, a short clip from my television debut, A Voyage Around the Monarchy.
"350 years ago, the English Civil War set Britain on a course towards a constitutional monarchy, the system we have today. The monarchy is seen as the cornerstone of the British way of life. Supposedly above politics, it helps define the nature of Britain and the British in the eyes of the world. A puzzle, the mother of democratic parliaments with an undemocratic inherited position at the very top. It seems so familiar to us that we rarely stop to ask ourselves, why? The monarchy is an unquestioned part of our lives on a daily basis. Newspapers, television, radio. Thousands of stories every year, sometimes bland, sometimes wildly impertinent, but all with the basic assumption that the monarchy is a good thing. I'm not anti-royal, but I can't help asking myself that if royal stories were treated in the same way as normal news stories, what would the dissenters be saying? And just maybe, wouldn't it be healthy to hear from them every now and then?
I was only 19 and clearly a bit of a troublemaker. And apologies for the lo-fi video and sound. All my clips that you're going to see today are pre-digital, so they only exist on old VHS. After making that film, I returned to my studies at Stirling. One of the real attractions for me at the university was the presence on the campus of the McRobert Arts Centre, with its huge main stage and studio theatre. I quickly became involved directing plays for the Drama Society, joining the board of the Arts Centre as student representative, the first of many boards, with governance becoming a recurring theme in my life, and ending up becoming director of the Scottish Student Drama Festival, an annual showcase of all student drama societies from across the country. So by the age of 20, I was running a drama festival, and I approached James Bond and Avengers star Diana Rigg to become our patron, who to my surprise lived nearby Stirling. This was a pivotal moment and a huge learning curve for me, as she was ferociously grand and quite unlike anyone I'd ever come across before. Diana actually was a terrific patron, showing up at all our receptions and showing and shows, as well as putting up with all our general studenty faffing about. Her association with the festival gave it real credibility, and I was really chuffed, as with her assistance, we didn't lose any money that year. A first, and sadly a last for the festival, as it keeled over a few years later. On one occasion, me and my friend Bill were invited over to Diana's country estate. I remember a very boozy lunch and being encouraged to help myself from her walk-in cupboard stacked high with silk cut, which as a penniless student was just the height of showbiz glamour. Like me, Diana was a hugely committed smoker, and I was very saddened to hear that it had finally caught up with her a few weeks back. But getting to grips with all the complexities of a week-long arts festival in a large venue at such a young age was clearly immensely valuable and stood me in really good stead 25 years later. However, my creative imagination was really fired by the nearby presence of the Edinburgh International Festival, where once a year the cream of the world's arts came to Scotland. I threw myself into that scene. I would typically immerse myself in around 60 shows during August, seeing work by amazing artists like Nina Gawa, Pina Bausch, Peter Stein, and artists on the fringe. Over the decades, I performed there, produced there, made television there, ran venues, and made lifelong friends. I cannot overstate how critical Edinburgh has been in my own creative development, despite being one of the least accessible cities in Europe for someone in a wheelchair. I would usually base myself at the one really accessible venue in town, William Burdett Coutts Assembly Rooms on George Street. And I pretty much stayed for 25 years. It was a fantastic and friendly melting pot. And consequently, I got to know a bizarre range of people, from producers to performers, Britt Ekland to June Brown, Arthur Smith to Penny Arcade. And fantastically incongruous and unexpected things happened there. One of my most treasured memories was escorting Barbara Windsor and Christopher Biggins to the European premiere of John Adams' contemporary opera Nixon in China. I mean, that just couldn't happen anywhere else. They made it to the second interval, which I thought was a result. And when I caught up with Barbara years later, she hadn't forgotten how much she hated it. But at the same time, I also became aware that as a career option, the arts were pretty limited due to the very basic access offered to me in the creaking old theatres and concert halls of Edinburgh. On leaving university with a really rubbish degree, as I had too many distractions, another career beckoned. Through my brief experience in 1986, I learned that all the television centres were purpose-built and were extremely accessible, as studios were designed to be on the ground floor for the huge big cameras on wheeled pedestals. So I followed my open golf dream and made it come true. And again, I was in luck. The late 1980s were the first big moment of equal representation in Britain, when broadcasters woke up to their lack of on-screen diversity. There was a moment available to break through and make change, to alter the traditional dynamic of Val, John, Pete and Leslie, and I threw myself at the opportunity. Oddly enough, I ended up signed with their agent, who had cornered the market in kids' TV presenters. My first job was presenting a children's TV show called Boom on Channel 4, which was produced by Anne Wood, a titan of kids' TV who had invented Roland Rat and Pob and went on to create Rosie and Jim and the Teletubbies with worldwide success. Anne was really my Svengali. She recognized something in me, maybe an ability to communicate, process information quickly, and it changed my life. Anne was the first of two maverick women from the northeast of England to profoundly influence my career, and to who I owe a great deal. And I'm very fortunate indeed to have had two such important mentors in my life. The format of Boom was groundbreaking, integrating disabled children with their non-disabled peers at a time education for children with disabilities was largely segregated. We sent disabled kids out on the road as Boom reporters, and I was kind of in effect the editor of their magazine. We had pop star guests, animal features, skydiving, feats of daring do. It was very much kids' TV of its time. I also helped devise the programme, and it reflected my worldview at the time about the importance of integration from a young age. And the concept worked. We achieved weekly audiences of 3 million, which made it a mainstream success for Channel 4. And to put that figure in context, it was roughly double what Vic Reeves' Big Night Out achieved at the same time. So to remind you of the very vibrant knitwear, which was de rigueur in late 80s children's television, with some fairly ropey sound, let's take a look at Boom.
Thanks very much, Alison. Hello and welcome to a really packed edition of Boom. This week, including a feature on my hometown, we've got details of a very special competition, and we've got the first of the bands from the Boom Music Awards. But before all that, many thanks for all the letters that you sent, and judging from our post, you're glad to see that Boom's back. For example, I've got a letter here from Emily Holdsworth from Christchurch in Dorset, and Emily wrote to say that she especially liked the big saxophone from the Nebworth feature last week. It's strange, Emily, they put the saxophone up on the stage and they filled it with red balloons, but we never saw the balloons released, I think because it started to rain. And also, thank you to the mysterious person that sent me these chocolates, and if Millie's very good, I shall give her one of these later on. David, who's a very experienced pilot, is just about bringing us into land. We've just narrowly missed some houses down there. We're going towards the trees, I think. I must admit, I don't want to go down. Now.
Sorry about that, I missed it.
Don't worry, we're okay. Oh, wonderful. Well, we're alive and we're well, and we're at one with Mother Earth. Well, if I can make a landing like that, I think anybody can. Goodbye. Can I really? Oh, thank you very much.
They're boarding a plane from Dundee. He was funny and very well built. But when he sat down, he started to frown. Because his spotter was under his kilt.
You're mad, Basil.
Oh, boom, boom.
In such a big arena, most people at the back don't get to see that much. And that's why the stage is so big and the lights are so huge. So that even from the back, the performer might just look like a little speck. You would at least get to see something.
As the audience started to arrive, the final sound checks were coming to an end. And the stars began to arrive too, to check out their arrangements and to get themselves ready.
Nobody notices all this. At least I hope they don't notice all this.
And while their minders weren't looking, we had a quick chat with a few of them and asked why they wanted to play at Nebworth.
Well, it's an interesting day out. And to play, obviously, to have fun.
If my father said no, I'd have been a bit of a cad, actually.
Vibrations, music. All right.
Those were heady days for me, and I can assure you that the hot air balloon crash was just terrifying. And I was lucky to come over with just a few bruises. What the footage didn't show was that the field that we crashed into was full of horses, and it was bordered by pylons. So I didn't make that mistake again. Boom established me as one of the first generation of disabled presenters of mainstream British television, and I guess a role model. But I was always vividly aware that I was an outsider with only temporary leave to remain in the fun factory. At the time, my punky and uber cool arch rival, Mick Scarlett, and I were the only disabled presenters on TV, and the opportunities for us both were limited, as after a while, broadcasters thought they had ticked the disability box with us and moved on, leaving us both without any real support mechanisms or value placed on what we did. Whilst I went on to front mainstream adult shows for BBC One and ITV, my presenting career was effectively brought to a premature halt in the mid-90s after an audition at the BBC, where I was told the Blue Peter audience are not yet ready for a disabled presenter. More recently, I had to withdraw from a recruitment process for the role of chief executive at Oxford Playhouse, a publicly funded theatre without a single wheelchair-accessible space in which I could be interviewed. 20 years apart, these experiences conveyed to me the same demoralising message that both in attitudinal and access terms, we have a long way to go before disabled people can truly compete on a level playing field. And that meant you needed to be super adaptive, resourceful, and as my dad predicted, work twice as hard as everyone else to keep afloat. But at the same time as I was crashing hot air balloons for fun, the disability arts movement began their overtly political campaign for inclusion, for the adoption of the social model of disability with their legendary slogan, "Nothing about us without us." The social model was a radically new way of thinking about disability, that it is society's structures and environments that disable us, not our medical conditions. From that single political movement came the leading British disabled-led arts companies such as Grey Eye, Canduco Dance and Shape Arts, whose support of disabled artists have transformed the UK's cultural landscape. Critical to their success also was the early advocacy and sustained investment of the Arts Council, of whom more later. Being a media figure, I was on the fringes of that movement, but as the 90s wore on, I realised I'd have to change direction. My presenting work was drying up and I made my last stand with HTV West in Bristol. So as I had trained in production, I became a director and producer of TV arts documentaries, making films about artists I admired like Derek Jarman, Bill Viola, Anthony Gormley, and Jerry Rafferty. And I really enjoyed telling their stories in such a visual medium. This was probably the part of my career that I loved the most and got the biggest creative kick from. I worked on BAFTA winning outside broadcasts like the BBC's 50th anniversary of VE Day in London, which was a massive event. And I was privileged to work with extraordinary people like Vera Lynn, the actress Molly Weir, Dad's Army creator Jimmy Perry, and Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela Harriman. When I interviewed her in Paris, she was President Clinton's ambassador to France. Whereas my disability was heavily messaged in my on-screen career, it was entirely irrelevant to these films, and I can't deny it was immensely liberating. The most personal of all my documentary work was the film I made about Billy Mackenzie, the late singer of the cult electro band The Associates. Billy had been such an inspiring figure for those of us growing up in Scotland in the 1980s. He was a glamorous Technicolor figure in an otherwise monochrome environment. Whilst he was an amazing vocalist and extraordinary songwriter, like me, he had the briefest moment in the limelight, and he also struggled with his sexuality, as I had done in my younger days. So I felt a great deal of empathy for Billy and put huge effort to make the documentary on the tiniest of budgets from Scottish television, which somehow stretched to multiple shoots across the UK and Zurich in Switzerland. I called in a lot of favours to assemble a starry cast to pay a suitable tribute to his great talent. So here's a short taste of the glamour chase.
Timeless singer. That voice to die for, an incredible voice.
Could do things with his voice that I would have paid £1 million to be able to do.
Yeah, definitely glamorous, and I think you can't have too much glamour.
Billy must have got through, we're talking millions of pounds.
He was a legend.
We lost the hell Hell of a singer and a hell of a person.
One of Scotland's most colourful pop stars has been found dead near his Dundee home. Billy Mackenzie became a household name in the 1980s, fronting the band The Associates.
Success doesn't mean everything, you know, so that's all I'm saying. I think it's good to sort of build things up and rip them apart once you're successful. No, just like a sort of Lego set.
Unlike most of my other pre-digital work, the full glamour of Billy Mackenzie can be found on YouTube, and it is worth a look. Go and have a look at it. It's great. By the early 2000s, production opportunities were drying up again. I'd received 1 or 2 commissions per year, so it felt like it was very much a hand-to-mouth, unsustainable existence. I got nominated for a BAFTA award, though, for my final program, Tune Team, made in Wales in 2002, and I naively thought, that's it, the phone won't stop ringing. It never started. Put simply, there was no value placed on supporting disabled talent, no sustainability, and no safety net. When I reluctantly made the decision to change my career again, there would actually be no disabled filmmakers or presenters on British TV for about another decade. Whilst there seemed to be an inevitability about my presenting career fizzling out, this time it actually felt hugely defeating. The stop-start approach of diversity initiatives had a devastating impact on my career, and it's something I campaign about now, decades later, in my work with the BFI to ensure that the same fate doesn't befall the next generation of disabled filmmakers. But I had one last card to play, my passion for the arts. While still in TV, I'd taken on roles advising London's Barbican Arts Centre on Access and being invited to judge the TMA Theatre Awards for several years. So in 2003, Arts Council England was actually something of a foreign legion for exiled television people. From the chair down, it was peppered with ex-producers. I joined as a music officer, then becoming head of performing arts in the West Midlands region, responsible for the funding of national opera companies and orchestras. It was a very different and much more disciplined environment than I was used to. It was a proper job, the first I'd really had, but I gotta say, I had a lot of fun. The Midlands Arts Council team were just great, a brilliant, maverick group of passionate experts from whom I learned so much about the dark arts of cultural funding. I used to look forward to spending my days in the office with colleagues like Suki Talwa, Ros Robbins, Anna Douglas, loved being based in Birmingham, and I became immersed in seeing work all over the country and across Europe, where I represented the Arts Council at international conferences and events. I ended up managing teams there as well, which I enjoyed a little bit less. And after 7 years, it was time for a new adventure. And this was where my second mentor came in. Another ex-broadcaster, Dame Hilary Boulding, was Director of Music at the Arts Council when I joined and had gone on to become Principal of the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama in Cardiff. She pursued an extraordinary vision of expansion for the college and embarked on a 25 million capital project to create a new concert hall, theatre and art centre. And she needed a venue director to create a public programme from scratch and establish the centre as a new venue in the city of Cardiff. With zero experience of doing anything similar, she turned to me. Looking back, this was an immense privilege, but also a vast challenge. I was responsible for delivering an opening season within weeks of handover from the builders, but quickly the audiences started to come. I was aided by the architectural beauty of the buildings, sleek-lined and sexy in a parkland setting with venues boasting excellent sightlines and acoustics. This was the most amazing train set I was ever going to be given to play with. I made the programme as accessible as I possibly could, removing all the academic language HE institutions usually employ. I mixed the student performance outputs with a wide range of visiting artists to fill the theatre and concert hall schedules, growing the audience tenfold during my tenure. Bringing in all my experience of those amazing Edinburgh festivals, I always focused on high quality, the unexpected and the incongruous, from tenor Ian Bostridge to the Penguin Cafe Orchestra, Soweto Kinch to the Kinshasa Symphony Orchestra, from Camille O'Sullivan to Shirley Bassey. We established weekly free commuter jazz sessions, a series of regular festivals featuring chamber music, student design, and newly commissioned plays, including the world premiere of Alistair McDowell's Pomona. We brought in big TV events from Children in Need and Doctor Who to BBC Young Musician of the Year, whose home the college has been for a decade. My final act at the college was to create and produce a year-long Wales-wide festival marking the centenary of the Russian Revolution across all art forms. Russia 17 was the first time the arts infrastructure of Cardiff really worked together to deliver a shared thematic programme, and the partnership included Welsh National Opera, the Sherman Theatre, the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, and the National Dance Company. We engaged Valery Gergiev, the conductor of the Mariinsky in St. Petersburg, and Welsh actor Michael Sheen to be our patrons. And the undertaking was vast, and it took years to put it together. The only thing we didn't pull off in the end was the Pet Shop Boys bringing their Battleship Potemkin live screening, as it was just so insanely expensive. But across online, broadcast and live events, we reached an audience of nearly 1 million people. And the whole thing was shortlisted for an RPS Music Festival of the Year award. Quite a feat for a college-led event. The fact that I became the first wheelchair user in the UK to run a major arts venue seemed entirely incidental to my pride in what we achieved artistically at the Royal Welsh. But it was challenging and hard work. Balancing the public and academic use of the space was always difficult, as academics were extremely territorial creatures. And also, I was splitting my time between Northamptonshire, where I live, and South Wales, where I worked. For anyone, that would be punishing to pull off over a period of years, but for me, it became increasingly tough and unsustainable. And that's when I started to encounter real difficulties, discovering the presence of an unbreakable glass ceiling that prevented me from moving on. And any non-disabled person who's achieved the success that I had in Cardiff would have easily swanned into a leadership role elsewhere. Somehow, I struggled. The rejections from development programs like CLOR and major arts institutions, some here in the Midlands, just like the experience at Oxford I had mentioned earlier on, began to pile up. Turning these frustrations into positive action, I started writing for Arts Professional in 2014. At the start, these were published anonymously, as I genuinely feared the climate of the time would hold me back even more. But the overwhelming sense of injustice and being a lone voice representing disability in the mainstream pushed me on. There was no recognition of ableism or the lack of workforce representation, and there were absolutely no visible disabled leaders. The public diversity focus was on gender equality and later race. Disability was off the radar. Yet our mainstream arts organisations and their boards are still primarily elite, white, middle class and non-disabled, entirely unrepresentative of a society made up of 13% Black, minority and ethnic populations, 21% disabled people, and a wider population of 90% who do not engage with the subsidised arts at all. So I gained a mission. I signed up to be one of the Arts Council's change makers, not so much to change me, but to change the environment for disabled people in the cultural sector. I joined Royal and Derngate Theatres in Northampton, primarily due to its proximity to where I lived, but also because their chief executive, Martin Sutherland, now also leading Coventry City of Culture, was a go-ahead visionary leader driving change in conservative Northamptonshire. The year at Northampton was full of insights, from the opening of a new cinema to the plan to develop a free school connected to the theatre and the launch of various new strands of work. But it also illustrated to me how challenging it was for a disabled individual to operate in that mainstream environment, much of it not accessible to me at all. So whilst I concluded that my leadership was needed to drive further change in the sector, it had to be delivered in a non-traditional way. Unaligned to a major organisation, very much on my own terms, I'm now balancing a portfolio of consultancy, from the University of Oxford to Coventry City of Culture, with a handful of non-executive directorships, including the Space and the Welsh National Opera. This time last year, I was overseeing the process to create a new board for WNO, and was delighted to have the opportunity of putting my principles into practice, appointing the company's first female chair in 75 years, and assembling the most diverse board in UK opera. From my time at the McRobert Arts Centre in Stirling, I understood how unpaid non-executive responsibilities enabled real change to happen. Since 2012, I've been a council member of the Arts Council of Wales and supported that institution recognise the importance of diversity, introducing the world's first disability arts access scheme, HINT, and influencing their corporate strategy for the benefit of all, which for the first time placed equalities as the key priority. So in 2018, when the opportunities to join the National Council of Arts Council England, led by Nick Sirota, or to become chair of the British Film Institute's Disability Advisory Group, or to be the UK government's first disability champion for arts and culture, I jumped at all three because I recognised that there was an opportunity to catalyse all my industry experiences, bring it all together, good and bad, for greater effect. In all these roles, I'm driven by a passion for democratising culture, ensuring disabled people can fully participate as artists, employees and audiences. That means having our voices heard throughout the UK's mainstream creative industries, raising profile, calling out the bad practice and setting in play positive initiatives to make real change. Pre-pandemic, the result of that work looked quite promising. Disability was becoming more visible than it had ever been in UK culture. Lost Voice Guy won Britain's Got Talent. We saw the first disabled-led concert at the BBC Proms from the Bournemouth Symphony Resound Ensemble. And the great Mexican artist Frida Kahlo was reclaimed as a great disabled artist at a sold-out V&A exhibition. Meanwhile, the UK's deaf and disabled artists were demonstrating to the world the quality and invention of their art. Artists such as Jess Tom, whose performance work is regularly televised by the BBC, and the Turner Prize shortlisted Yinka Shonibari. This artistic vitality was endorsed by Darren Henley, who stated, "The work of disabled and deaf artists is often the boldest, most aesthetically adventurous art out there." At ACE, as a council member, I took a robust position on the development of Let's Create, the new 10-year strategy, and I'm convinced its inclusive approach will benefit disabled artists, audiences, and employees. By bringing lived experience of disability to their board table, it also enabled me to influence and often improve access at major capital investments such as the factory in Manchester. After I made an intervention over in Belfast, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland committed to roll out a disability audit of its entire funded portfolio. And as a consequence of the disability advisory group that I lead, the BFI has committed to a range of sweeping measures to outlaw cripping up, advocating fair pay, and improving disabled representation on screen. And two of my disability champion initiatives, a UK-wide arts access scheme for disabled audiences and a disability cultural charter, have been supported by the 4 UK arts councils, the BFI and DCMS, and are slowly chugging through the system to eventually become realities. And then COVID hit and everything stopped. Except for me, only the traveling really stopped. And over the last 6 months, I've never been busier. My wonderful partner of 20 years, Tim, and I have been locked down throughout. We've barely left the house and will continue in self-imposed exile until the health threat diminishes significantly. And there's no sign of that at the moment. Disabled people have felt badly overlooked throughout the pandemic, despite accounting for 2/3 of all coronavirus deaths in the UK. We all know COVID has magnified existing inequalities nowhere more acutely than in our devastated creative industries. Activism to highlight these inequalities has brought to the fore the voices of those with the most to lose as the industry unravels: creative freelancers, Black and Asian workers, and disabled artists. I quickly recognized the pandemic's threat to all the progress creative disabled people have made since the 1980s. So together with Grey Eye's Jenny Seeley, we launched We Shall Not Be Removed in May, the first UK-wide disability arts alliance to raise the profile of creative disabled people and to advocate for a more inclusive recovery. Our alliance now has 700 members made up of disabled practitioners or organisations working inclusively from across all art forms, all impairment groups, and from across the 4 UK nations. And this represents the biggest disability arts movement since the 1980s. We achieved profile through open letters sent to the 4 UK culture ministers in June and a participatory social media roar that celebrated the brilliant work of disabled artists, which achieved a top 3 UK trend on Twitter. Across the summer, I published endless articles and submitted weighty evidence to several parliamentary COVID committees, all to ensure creative disabled people were not forgotten. This work condensed into 3 public campaigns. I drove the publication of the 7 inclusive principles to support the sector achieve an inclusive recovery, while shaping the BFI Press Reset campaign to champion disabled people's continued participation in TV and film. And I assisted the Audiences Access Alliance form their Building Back for All campaign to ensure live events remain accessible for disabled audiences. But in all of this, the biggest achievement has been to place ableism firmly on the table for the industry to deal with. Outside of the disability community, ableism is still a largely unfamiliar term, but assuredly as racism, sexism, ageism, and homophobia, ableism wrecks opportunities for talented disabled people. And it's what lies behind the reality of disabled people very often having to work twice as hard as everyone else, as my dad correctly predicted all those years ago, because we are so rarely accepted on our own terms. Put simply, ableism is a behavior which either unintentionally excludes or actively discriminates. It applies to a wide range of situations, from limited physical access to poor understanding of the support deaf, neurodiverse, and disabled people need to succeed. As I've demonstrated today, ableism has certainly impacted my own career in broadcasting and in the arts. Whilst I've had my share of successes, with the right support, I think I could have done a great deal more. So we all need to recognise and tackle ableism head on to stop it blighting the careers of the next generation of creative disabled people. And that's my real challenge to the sector today and my current mission. My career is kind of hard for me to sum up or draw conclusions from. Perhaps that's for you to do and to ask questions about. But here is my attempt at 5 takeaways from today. If you're disabled, I would encourage you to be radical and drive further change. Challenge the status quo. Change is a continuum and it never stops. Be flexible, but be willing to work twice as hard as everyone else. It's a tough message, but don't ever give up. If you're not disabled, be a good ally to us and ensure disability is firmly embedded in your lexicon of diversity, and ensure you engage lived experience before making decisions that may impact disabled people. Disabled or not, make the social model of disability non-negotiable. It's an empowering methodology which offers disabled people a voice and status, and in cultural terms, it's produced great artistic returns. Recognise and call out ableism. It is the root cause of so much of the exclusion that I and other disabled people face in society every day. And finally, let's create a more inclusive industry on the other side of this catastrophe. I believe it is possible, and with renewed effort by all of us, I think we can make it happen. With no safe endpoint yet in sight, I hope that my work continues to offer a profile for creative disabled people, and that We Shall Not Be Removed becomes a vehicle to ensure we can be present in the critical conversations that will shape all our creative futures. Because on the other side, we will all have been through too much to allow the old discriminatory barriers re-emerge to prevent inclusion. Thank you very much for listening. I hope sharing my experiences of this amazing, if often frustrating industry have been useful. And I'm very happy to open up the discussion and hear your views on my strange and twisted tale. Meanwhile, I leave you with one more entirely gratuitous image of me with a glove puppet. Helga, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks so much for that. That's quite it's kind of a big roller coaster. There's a lot of stuff in here. I was going to ask you a question. I might go straight into some group questions, but I suppose what I might just, for a moment, when you talk about ableism, and it will lead into the question we have with Zoe as well, is that it strikes me that a couple of instances you've really talked about, be that a BBC many years ago that couldn't conceive of an audience of children accepting a presenter in a wheelchair, to a much more recently a venue just not having conceived of the infrastructure that it would be necessary for you to do to present at your best, to have an interview. That it absolutely is discrimination, but where that discrimination starts is with a lack of imagination. And the one thing we do know, we've worked with Professor Richard Crisp, Professor of Psychology, who looks at the positive, the upside of being inclusive and diversity thinking, is that everybody expands their imaginative capacity. So I suppose do you think there's a real appreciation that this isn't just about ramps? It's very important, but it isn't just about ramps, is it? It's about enlarging our imaginative and emotional capacity as well as everything else. And what's your thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Helga. I mean, ramps are important, and all other access is really important. And as I say, I've always been aware that it's been there as in front of house for audiences, but it's not there back of house in administration and backstage areas. And that's a real issue that still needs to be tackled. And I think it's still very off-putting for disabled people to enter this career knowing that they've got a real problem about that. So yeah, that I wouldn't want to diminish that.
No,
certainly in terms of the thinking, I think what's really disappointing is in both the industries that I've worked in broadcasting and the arts, we are the creative industries. We are the creative thinkers. And actually there has been an extraordinary lack of imagination around disability for many years. And expectation has only grown incrementally and very slowly. It was clear that, you know, when venues were upgraded to become accessible in the 80s and 90s, it was for audiences. They weren't.
Why would you? You weren't doing it.
Exactly. And so when my horrible experience at Oxford came around, you know, even although my access requirements were clear on the form, they just hadn't read it, because why would they expect somebody coming for a chief executive job to have an access requirement?
Do you remember years ago there was that whole puzzle about there's a surgeon and they go, I can't operate on this person, it's my son, and the tip off line is the surgeon is a woman, and you get it wrong because
but I think that lack of imagination also extended to the fact that I think it took a very long time before disability was really understood within the diversity context. And I think actually disabled people were not considered to be diverse a decade ago. And that's actually something that the Arts Council's creative case for diversity, as a consequence of the Equality Act, has had to change.
I'll come back to the Arts Council in a minute. I'm going to move on to so that I think that moves nicely into our first question from someone whose name is Zoe. Hello, Zoe. It's a very journalistic question. It starts with a quote from you. You are quoted, it says, as saying, "I want to use my influence to further democratise our national culture and to ensure that it is accessible to everyone." And so the question is, how do we ensure that all people with lived experiences of being disabled by society, defined medically and linguistically by their impairments and health conditions, juxtaposed negatively as invalid or scrounger, are represented in an equitable way in all walks of life at every level, but as specifically as creative leaders, a little bit more, music leaders, teachers, musicians, so that current and upcoming generations have recognisable role models that look to communicate and play music, how we do, that enables us all to progress, lead and feel proud of who we are, whoever we are, deaf, visually impaired, wheelchair users, regardless of ethnicity, gender, age, religion, sexuality and finance. So I think, so that's quite a big question, but I hope I'm not paraphrasing too much, but you know, how are we going to look at representation in an equitable way that helps current generations coming up to, so where are the role models? How do we make them public, and what effect can that have? I think it's another aspect of ableism that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Zoe, and thank you for it. And you're right, I did say that. That was a quote from me. But I absolutely 100% behind it, because actually I think, to unpack your question, I think it's about the social model of disability and it's about ableism. And for me, those two things are absolutely fused. You know, ableism is the promotion of able-bodied people. And that's what we've got to bring to an end, because that's what holds disabled people back. That's why we're not perceived in the kind of roles that you name check. And I think that requires a different approach in society. It requires certainly a different approach and framework in the arts, because, as I say, I think the creative case, a truly intersectional approach, has driven us considerable distance in the last decade. We've stopped short in some areas, such as There are way too few disabled people employed by arts organisations, something like 6% in England, 2% in the other UK nations. 5% of chairs of boards are disabled. These are really low percentages compared to the fact that we make up 21% of our population.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, across the board. You know, in television, I think it's something like 7% of people on screen are disabled, 5% make the programs. So, you know, this isn't simply an
And also, you don't, a great thing that was pointed out to me once is you don't have people who just happen to be, like the person in the newsagents in EastEnders doesn't happen to be disabled. There has to be a disabled character who has a disabled storyline. You know, like, you just, whereas people I know in my life who are disabled aren't there as my disabled storyline person. They're just in my life, you know.
So we need to have a different framework that changes the narrative. And I think that is fundamentally about our greater understanding of ableism, in exactly as I described in the presentation, that it's alongside racism and homophobia and all the others that hold people back, that are outdated ways of thinking. And it really made me think this summer that Black Lives Matter absolutely made us change the way that we think about racism.
Yep.
You know, we kind of thought we dealt with racism, or some of us had in certain bubbles. But actually what we discovered this summer that we hadn't even scratched the surface of it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of frustration and exhaustion under there. And in many ways it's similar with disabled people in different contexts. But there is exhaustion about having to justify ourselves all the time. And so I think we need to see new initiatives and a new policy framework that really makes people understand ableism in a wider context.
I'm going to, I hope I get this right, Jazz. This is from Jazz Morton, who's actually one of our Advantage Fellows. In this day and age, says Jazz, shouldn't we have pushed so hard for full equality and inclusion as people with disabilities? That I think she's saying that disability arts / disabled artists aren't in a special category. I acquired a brain injury at 13 and have fought for equality ever since. And then she says, by the way, my mum went to Stirling in the late 80s, early 90s.
Ooh.
I think that's just, I know it's going to say,
Nona.
I was going to say, well, if you could put that in the chat, Jazz, we can find out. There's quite a few. So should we be, does a special category help? Again, I think I'm paraphrasing that, but yes, I'm just.
Well, when you look back at the history of it, and as a historian, I always do that. You know, in the 70s and 80s, we were putting in place better access for front of house in venues. In the 80s and 90s and early noughties, we were putting funding to support disabled artists and develop the organisations like the Grey Eyes, Kandukus and Shape. And then over the last decade, that's all sort of come together so that actually we're in a much better place. You know, disabled people are winning awards for UK theatre awards. There's been great stuff, great progress in theatre and in other art forms. And so there has been a continuum. There has been progress. And I think it's been necessary to have those categories through that. But actually, I would argue now that Grey Eye is more of a mainstream company with mainstream connections, and the work of its offshoot, Ramps on the Moon, which works with all the regional repertory companies around the country, producing award-winning production like Tommy. You know, there's evidence there that actually those lines are blurring now. And I think that's a good thing. And as we go into this new decade, into the next 10 years, I think that's got to blur further. But at the same time, there needs to be specific support and specific policy frameworks to support disabled people, to ensure that disabled people can come through.
Yeah, it's about the removal of barriers, isn't it? You're talking about categorization, and Jazz, I know there's another question from you, but I'm just going to ask a couple of other questions from other people, and if we'll have time, people will get a second go. Mandy Fowler, hi Mandy. As I've been thinking about the use of the word intersectionality, and you've touched on it in your previous answer actually, when what we mean is occupying positions of multiple cultural identity. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about the lived experience of disabled people occupying more than one position of cultural identity, and how we can create a better understanding of that in that sector, in the sector.
Yeah,
I think intersectionality, it's disbanded, it's kind of bandied about now, but I think it's just another, yeah. What's your thought about the multiplicity of barriers, really, which is inherent in people who are intersectional?
Yeah, there's loads, and I occupy several. You know,
yeah.
Gay and disabled and Scottish, and it's an important issue, and I don't think we've got a clear. I don't think the sector is great at grasping these intersections, and I also sense that intersectionality as a concept at the moment is really under strain. I think it's really being stretched, particularly because of the pandemic, and the different needs and different requirements of different groups of people, and the different levels of threat and risk we're all living with. So I think there are some really important issues we do need to dig down into and get some clarity on. I don't have the answers, because actually I'm not seeing the evidence of great practice anywhere. I think some companies like Unlimited, for their
commissioning strands
actually do great work in this way, and I've been part of their panels, and we go into great detail to ensure that intersectionality is reflected in all the awards that are made. But I'm very conscious that there are many people who are feeling extremely marginalized and in a great deal of pain at the moment in terms of what's going on in the broader environment, and I think we need to understand that better for us to be able to move forward.
Yes, I could go on about that, but I want to go to questions. So we have Diane mentioned in Dispatches earlier, your sister.
What she said.
She's going to say why you were in the kilt. No, she's not. Can Andrew suggest what mechanisms over and above access should be in place to support disabled artists, producers, and others in the creative and cultural industries? So, what mechanisms over and above access would you put in place, or have you, where you've had the chance to do that?
I think it's about creating opportunities for training. I think it's about developing better opportunities for leadership, for demonstrating leadership. Some of these programs have already started in England, Transforming Leadership, which the Arts Council rolled out a couple of years ago, or last year, I think. But I certainly think that, as we get through this pandemic, we're going to need initiatives to support disabled audiences to come back, because the evidence that after the Interval Act 2 revealed in the summer was that disabled audiences have had a huge loss of confidence as a consequence of this. And they're going to need additional support. So things like the National Arts Access Card, I think, would be a really helpful card to play to assist them. So across the board, I think, it's a good question, Diane. There's loads of other things. There's loads of other initiatives, as well as policy frameworks that are needed. And
then rolling back to Zoe's question right at the beginning, and part that, and visible role models. Visible
role models.
That's
of which
that's
there are more, some now.
Some, but still quite, as you say, that your career has been characterized by being the first, the only, the whatever, wheelchair user, whatever, it's, there's still a way to go.
Yeah.
A question from Sherry Edgar. Hi, Sherry. I feel like I'm on local radio, and it's a shout out to Sherry Edgar now. Why do you think you were approached to be head of programme at Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama? Do you think they wanted a person from a media background to help transform the arts programme? And I don't know if this was or is, and was the Access to Work scheme used enough in the arts? I think there's two questions there. So do you think your media background in terms of the programming role that you did, and a little bit about access to work in the arts?
I think that the reason, because Hilary came from the Arts Council as well, she recognised the sort of things that you pick up at the Arts Council, and at the Arts Council you get this incredible overview of what's going on, and you kind of dip in and out in this and that, and actually I, had a reputation when I was at the Arts Council in Birmingham as being the classical music person. But actually I knew more about theatre than I did about classical music, but I was able to apply different things across art forms. So I think actually for Hilary, it was probably more a sort of, it was about, having multiple art form experience. So understanding classical music, but also being able to do theatre and knowing how to program that. In terms of access to work, I think access to work terrifies a lot of people in our sector, because it is a complex benefit, and it's not well understood. And I know, there's been some great work on this. The Arts Council worked with Disability Arts Online to create a really useful and easy to understand guide that was published last year, still available, and Jess Tom presented it, I think. But yeah, there are issues around access to work, and I'd like to see access to work, and I've advocated this for quite a long time to the government, that there needs to be a passporting scheme, particularly for freelance disabled individuals, because for disabled artists, it's a much more complex process.
Yeah, and you have to earn a certain amount, and you're going in and out. Thank you. I've got one more question to Helen, and then if we have time, I'll go back to Jazz's. But Helen Kilby-Nelson, also an Advantage fellow. And this is really interesting, actually, because how would you approach making visible the invisible disabilities? And that's come up in different contexts, hasn't it, recently with COVID and things like that, that people who pass, as it were, for able-bodied have got some conditions. So yeah, what have you got any thoughts on that? I think it's a massive subject. But
again, I think this is where ableism and an understanding of ableism can really come in, because that's not getting ableism is the thing that I think is a big issue for people with non-visible disabilities. And there's also the issues around self-declaration. Right. And I think that's a big thing that we've got to deal with as well. And that's about the environment that we operate in. That's how our perceptions of disability in your community, at the place you work, or wherever. Yeah. And there's a big issue. I mean, those statistics that I mentioned earlier on, what is it, 5% of chairs being disabled in the MPO portfolio, 6% of the workforce, 7% of trustees. Those aren't true figures, because we know there is a huge level of non-declaration within the sector. And somehow we've got to get over that. And that's about the normalization of disability. And that's about understanding the social model. And that's about making ableism no longer really being an acceptable place to hide.
Yeah. Yes, I understand that. Yes. I am going to go back to Jazz's question. I think we've got a couple of other questions. But Jazz said, I feel like when people with disabilities go on something like Britain's Got Talent, everyone, the non-disabled media and public, creates a media spectacle of, isn't this wonderful, a disabled star, what an achievement. Maybe something similar may happen in, well, it used to happen in the Paralympics and the Special Olympics, and now that doesn't happen quite so much, does it? But what an achievement. And then we don't hear about them ever again. Is my cynicism unhelpful? Almost undoubtedly, Jazz, but let's ask the question. Is my cynicism unhelpful? And should I jump on media bandwagons such as these? It's just that realistically, we face ableism every day in our society. So over-exuberant celebration of disabled artists seems false and patronising. Can I just, and I just want to add something. We had some unconscious bias training when I was at Birmingham Hippodrome, and it was led by a woman who was a lesbian, and we were talking about exactly, if we've got the picture of the person in the wheelchair, should we really, isn't it a bit mechanical? Isn't it a bit manipulative to make sure they're in the photo? Isn't that, we can't. And she said, I'm a lesbian, and I love it when I see those adverts where lesbians are getting mortgages or they're buying toilet roll. She said, I don't care, it's tokenistic. I feel included. I like it. So, so I suppose is it a bandwagon? Are people genuinely, should we be cynical about these, suddenly I've noticed that mixed race couples have suddenly been allowed to, shop at Tesco's and buy washing powder. but should we be cynical about these things, or should we welcome them as people just, again, enlarging their imagination in that way we've been talking about?
It's all about visibility.
Right.
It's all, and I learned that back in the 80s with Boom. It was primarily, you know, what its real legacy was around visibility. It increased visibility of disabled children in our sector, where otherwise they were treated as you know, kind of, you know, the other, you know, sort of strange creatures. And of course this Boom, along with Mick Scarlett's programs, normalized that. And when it comes to you know, Lost Voice Guy, I take your point. I take your point because I happen to know that Lee, the Lost Voice Guy, has not been engaged by ITV since he won Britain's Got Talent. And they made a big deal, and it was great that he won, and the support that they gave him through that program was fantastic, and it was really well done. But actually, he hasn't been engaged by that channel since.
Yeah.
So visibility is really important.
Yeah.
I think it is for any minority group.
Yeah.
Even disabled people. That's really important, and that's also one of the big risks of this pandemic, is that we become invisible.
Yeah.
And of course, that was one of the reasons we set up We Shall Not Be Removed, is to try and stop that within the arts sector. But visibility is really important. And I agree with your lesbian friends who, you know, when they see it on TV, they recognize that that's great. It's not about lip service. And I think, even though I wasn't part of the disability arts movement, I was kind of part of something, because I was also about creating visibility at that time in the 80s and 90s. And I think we're in a similar point now, and the more visibility we can get, the better, because it can all too easily, as we've just found, be taken away from us.
Yeah. I think we're going to just go to our final question now before we wrap up for people. I have this is coming through from two different people, so forgive me if I'm going to credit you both, and one of you actually asked it. So, hi Andrew, thank you for sharing your journey with us. We all have different ways of learning, processing information and communicating, but workplaces tend to be set up to cater for a very structured way of working that the employee needs to adapt to. Do you have any advice on how to help organisations be open to different ways of working? That could be Aisha, or it could be Zoe who asked that question. So apologies if well, thank you to both of you, whoever. So different ways of working inside organisations that clearly are maybe set up in a very structured way.
I think it's really important. And as I mentioned in the presentation, you know, when I was at Roland Derngate, it was a very structured organisation way of working. And I, you know, I experienced some issues within that, but partly physical access, but also how things were done. And I think organisations do need additional support to get this stuff right, because I'm afraid I'm all too familiar with, you know, organisations launching diversity initiatives, thinking, oh yeah, great, we've got to do that, and then getting it really badly wrong. And the person that comes out of it badly and suffering is perhaps the disabled person that's been engaged, who doesn't last very long in the organization and leaves the industry thinking, oh God, I'm not ever going to do that again, because they just didn't know where to begin to deal and accommodate my specific requirements. So yes, organizations do need to do that, and we need to be investing in that. And I hope actually that the new inclusive principle of Arts Council England's strategy will contain tools and support mechanisms and ways of supporting organizations to do that. Because if we're saying we need to see more disabled people employed and on your board and all of these things, we've got to provide the necessary mechanisms to ensure that these measures are going to be successful, because we can't afford any more diversity schemes that just don't work.
Fall flat, yeah. Just going to wrap up one more. I'm a bit naughty of me because I said this last one, but because it does come into this. How do you embrace the challenge of making disability visible without obliging? This is from Hayley, who's another of our Hayley Williams, who's another Advantage Fellow. How do you embrace the challenge of making disability visible without obliging individuals to necessarily expose themselves? When we know that declaring conditions exposes people to prejudice. I think it relates back to your previous. It seems to me that is a related question to ableism. But you know, one might not feel capable or confident to have that visibility.
And I completely understand that, and you know, the hate crime figures completely support that assertion, that there is still a lot of hostility to disabled people, and also through the pandemic that also might risk perceptions, and the perceptions are at the moment is that the public are making huge sacrifices to support the vulnerable, and you know, there are big risks around that in terms of perceptions of disability which could send us back years, but it's an important element, I think, of, you know, and actually I've put this to the government. I've said, actually what we need is public information and education to the public for them to understand the issues around disability in simple, straightforward ways. They can do it, you know, with Brexit and the NHS through the pandemic. They should really do it around disability, because if you really wanted to crack, you know, as the questioner mentioned, the stigma that still surrounds disability, there needs to be wider education and support, because you're absolutely right, it exists, and it's very, very difficult to deal with.
Well, as a final thing, maybe then from Caroline, how do we support each other as opposed to divide and rule? Who's worst off? I think there's, you know, people playing top trumps, top protected characteristic trumps. How do we support each other, particularly, as you said, the need for acknowledging all of our fears and losses with COVID?
And we need to make sure that we don't fall into that trap of playing top trumps around diversity and intersectionality. It's a danger. Divide and rule always works, and so we must make sure we don't fall into that trap. And I think we have to do so with kindness and with respect, and by adopting and understanding as much as we can, and learning as much as we can about the other perspectives. It's a bit of a, you know, woolly answer, but it's the best one I can give, because I do think it's a risk. I do think intersectionality at the moment is really under risk, really under stress, and we've got to find ways of bringing it back and making sure that we're all working for the greater good of majority, and not simply individually for ourselves.
Thank you. And finally, you mentioned the I just, as a last sort of,
how many finals are you going to have?
I know, sorry, I know I'm just, but
no, on you go.
To leave us on a perhaps more
positive,
a more optimistic note. What are your hopes for Let's Create, the 10-year strategy? What do you think? If we do it right, how could it be a game changer?
I think what will be a game changer is a greater understanding of ableism in the Arts Council itself, in the sector, and that is about a sort of campaign exploring what the themes are, rolling out not just unconscious bias training, but also what is ableism and how do we recognize it, and how do we you know, root it out within our organizations and our spheres of influence. So I think that's a really critical element. And then on the back of that, we need to see some specific policy developments. You know, what I mentioned earlier around audiences, around talent development from entry routes into the profession, investment into the sector for capital, investment for access improvements. There are a whole range of things that I'd really like to see. So those are my hopes. But I think my biggest hope is a vaccine, and a vaccine that's going to be effective in some sort of way, because I think until that comes, we're all going to be in these celebrity squares, and disabled people are going to be leading reduced lives that are very limiting, and you know, until that vaccine arrives, you know, we're going to be struggling. So that's my main hope for the future. It's quite difficult to see beyond that.
Yes.
But
well, yes, a vaccine that works and is very easily and very quickly administered.
Absolutely. And if you'd asked me this last year about Let's Create, I'd have said, oh, it's going to be about a sector that is truly values equalities, that truly is balanced in terms of its workforce and its governance, all those things. That's what I would have been thinking about, you know, 10 years down the line. And that those organizations that don't contribute are no longer part of the portfolio. I still think that's likely to happen, but actually, I can't really get much beyond a Trump defeat and a vaccine.
A Trump defeat and a vaccine. I can't think of any. What more could we wish for from everybody? So, thank you all so much for your participation, for your listening, for your questions. We've got, everybody's still here. So thank you for staying with us and listening to us. Andrew, thank you so much. Thanks to our funders. Lara, thank you for your curation of questions. Wendy, thank you for the captioning, and Gareth, thanks for your engineering in the background. It was all really seamless. And thanks to you all. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the evening. Stay tuned. Sign up to us. Sign up to our mailing list. You'll hear more about more masterclasses. We can't tell you who they are yet, but they're going to be great. So please come and join us for our next one, which hopefully will be later on in November. Thanks all, and good night. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.